Ukraine's strike on a Russian rail network worth close to $480 million delivered more than physical damage. It created a moment that forced Moscow to confront a vulnerability it has tried to downplay since the early days of the conflict. Russia's entire military strategy relies heavily on large-scale, centralized movement of equipment, ammunition, and personnel. When the rail system is disrupted, the entire operational rhythm begins to slow, and that's exactly what happened here. The attack didn't just hit infrastructure. It hit the foundation of Russia's logistical identity. And it did so at a moment when the Kremlin can least afford disruption. What makes this even more striking is how the attack demonstrated a level of precision and timing that suggests Ukraine is not just reacting anymore. It is shaping the battlefield far beyond the front lines. And that is a shift Russia did not expect. The real story behind this strike is that it exposed how fragile Russia's mobility network becomes when pressure is applied to the right point. For years, Russia has relied on the assumption that its vast geography provides natural protection. The railways span thousands of miles, connecting regions like arteries that keep the state functioning. But when nearly $500 million of this infrastructure is destroyed in one blow, it becomes clear that size alone cannot guarantee security. This is where the hook emerges. Ukraine has learned exactly where to strike to turn Russia's strengths into weaknesses. Hitting such a high-value rail system wasn't just about disrupting trains. It was about interrupting the flow of an entire war effort. Moments like this matter because they force both sides to rethink what is possible. For Russia, the loss instantly slowed the movement of armored units and heavy munitions heading toward contested areas. Commanders were pushed to reroute supply chains, stretching them through longer and less secure pathways. Every mile added to those routes increases the strain on fuel, time, and manpower. The Kremlin knows this, and the frustration behind the scenes is palpable. When the military machine can't move the way it's designed to, the front line starts to feel the pressure. Soldiers wait longer for ammunition. Repairs take more time. Reserves arrive later than planned. A single strike becomes a multiplier of problems. Another angle to consider is how this strike shapes perceptions far beyond the battlefield. Russia has built its image on the idea that it maintains control over its internal systems. Yet this event offers a very different picture. It reveals a state whose critical infrastructure can be hit with a level of accuracy that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. It also sends a message to Russian citizens who have already been questioning the cost and direction of the war. If a rail network so central to national operations can be destroyed, what else is vulnerable? That doubt spreads quickly, and once it takes hold, it becomes difficult for leaders to reverse. What makes this strike even more important is the coordination behind it. This wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, and aligned with a larger strategy to weaken Russia's ability to sustain long campaigns. When a rail network of this scale goes offline, the army has to rely on alternative transport options that are slower, more expensive, and easier to target again. This gives Ukraine new leverage and gives Russia new problems it cannot solve overnight. The attack serves as a reminder that war is not only about territory, it is about rhythm, supply, and the ability to keep moving. Ukraine targeted that movement directly, and the impact is far greater than the visible damage on the ground. The strike didn't just damage a key rail network. It exposed a far deeper issue inside Russia's security structure, one the Kremlin has tried hard to hide. For months, attacks on Russian territory have followed a pattern that points to a growing inability to protect critical sites. But this incident pulled that weakness into full view. When you see a network worth hundreds of millions of dollars crippled by a single coordinated operation, it tells you that the system meant to prevent such attacks is no longer functioning the way Moscow claims. This is where the hook becomes impossible to ignore. Russia cannot safeguard its own strategic infrastructure. How can it sustain a war built on the illusion of complete internal control? The heart of the problem lies in Russia's dependence on vast but aging security layers that were never designed for a conflict of this scale or complexity. The country has long relied on distance as its natural shield. The idea was simple. Targets deep inside Russian territory would always be out of reach. Yet the strike proved that this assumption no longer holds. Ukraine has developed the capability to reach far beyond the border, and every time it does, it reveals gaps in Russia's early warning systems, air defenses, and internal surveillance network. These weaknesses don't just create temporary disruptions, they create psychological cracks, and once those appear, confidence within the state starts to thin. There's also the growing challenge of defending infrastructure spread across thousands of miles. Russia has critical assets in every direction, but its military and security services cannot cover all of them effectively. When a network this significant is struck, it suggests that defensive priorities have been stretched too thin. Commanders are forced to decide which sites to protect and which to leave exposed. That kind of decision-making creates opportunities for Ukraine to exploit, and this strike demonstrated exactly that. It hit a location that should have been heavily secured yet was vulnerable enough to be taken offline with precision. This alone sends a message that Russia's defensive posture isn't just strained, it's failing at the points where it matters most. Another layer that makes this moment so telling is how quickly Russia scrambled to explain the incident. The state moved to minimize the impact, but the scale of the destruction made that narrative hard to defend. When citizens see videos of burning rail corridors or hear delays across multiple regions, the official message loses its weight. People know something larger is happening. The disconnect between what the Kremlin says and what the population sees grows wider. And that distrust becomes a pressure point the government cannot fully manage. The hook here is clear. Every strike inside Russia doesn't just break infrastructure, it breaks confidence. This situation also complicates Russia's military planning. If important sites can be struck deep behind the lines, commanders must divert resources to protect them. That means fewer assets available at the front, fewer reinforcements, and more strain on a war machine already running hot. It forces Russia to play defense in places it never expected to defend. And when a state that prides itself on overwhelming strength starts reacting instead of dictating the pace, it marks a shift in momentum that is hard to reverse. Ultimately, what this strike revealed is that Russia is no longer operating from a position of assumed safety. The country that once believed its infrastructure was untouchable is now racing to keep up with threats that bypass its old systems entirely. The security gaps are real, they're widening, and Ukraine's ability to expose them grows with every attack. In a conflict defined by endurance and adaptation, this is the kind of vulnerability that reshapes the entire strategic picture. Turkey's quiet involvement in the strike adds a new layer of complexity to the conflict, one that Russia cannot easily ignore or dismiss. For years, Ankara has positioned itself as a balancing force, maintaining ties with Moscow while still cooperating with NATO partners, but this operation hints at a shift beneath the surface. When Turkish technology, intelligence, or indirect support contributes to an attack on a major Russian rail network, it signals that Ankara is becoming more assertive in shaping regional outcomes. This is where the hook draws attention. Turkey is no longer merely observing the war from a careful distance. It is choosing specific moments to tip the balance, and those moments carry significant weight. What makes Turkey's role so significant here is the strategic message it sends. Ukraine cannot reach this level of precision without strong partnerships, and Turkey is one of them. Few countries capable of providing tools that alter the battlefield in practical, measurable ways, whether it's advanced drone platforms, intelligence coordination, or logistical assistance. Turkey's involvement amplifies Ukraine's reach far beyond what it could achieve alone. Russia understands this, and that's why this strike has triggered such concern behind the scenes. It's not just the destruction that troubles the Kremlin, it's the realization that another influential regional power is quietly participating in ways that weaken Russia's long-term position. Ankar's motivations are also important to consider. Turkey has its own regional agenda, its own security concerns, and its own calculations about Russia's future strength. By assisting Ukraine at key moments, Turkey reinforces its standing within NATO while maintaining leverage over Moscow. It creates a situation where Russia needs Turkish cooperation in areas like energy, trade, and regional diplomacy, yet cannot fully control Ankara's choices. This dynamic puts Turkey in a uniquely powerful position, and it allows Ankara to influence the conflict without appearing to take a fully confrontational stance. The hook here is subtle but sharp. Turkey is playing a long game, and every targeted action expands its influence. This kind of involvement also sends a message to Ukraine's other partners. It shows that regional powers outside the core Western bloc are willing to step in when they see strategic value. That encouragement matters. When one nation takes risks or provides critical support, others reconsider their limits. Turkey's contribution to this strike may therefore inspire additional cooperation from states that previously hesitated to challenge Moscow too directly. This could reshape the broader diplomatic environment and put additional pressure on Russia's ability to rely on ambiguity or fear to deter assistance to Ukraine. Another element worth noting is how this affects Russia's perception of its own alliances. For years, the Kremlin viewed Turkey as a complicated but manageable partner. They cooperated in Syria, negotiated energy deals, and maintained a working relationship despite frequent disagreements. But this strike disrupts that balance. If Russia begins to see Turkey as an active enabler of Ukrainian operations, it must reassess its entire strategy toward Ankara. That opens new diplomatic vulnerabilities and forces the Kremlin to question how many of its current relationships might shift if the war continues to drag on. The psychological effect of that uncertainty is profound because Russia depends heavily on projecting control and confidence. Turkey's role in this moment also highlights how modern warfare depends on networks rather than isolated state actors. Ukraine's ability to carry out bold, deep strikes is not purely local. It's the product of collaboration, shared intelligence, foreign-made technology, and strategic timing. Russia knows this, and it recognizes that as long as Ukraine can maintain these partnerships, its own defense will be challenged in ways it cannot fully predict or counter. The hook emerges clearly here. The more Turkey supports Ukraine even discreetly, the more Russia loses the advantage it once assumed was guaranteed. All of this turns a single strike into a geopolitical signal. It tells the world that Turkey sees opportunity in shaping the conflict and is willing to act when it serves its interests. And for Russia, it raises the unsettling possibility that more regional powers may follow Turkey's lead, quietly strengthening Ukraine's hand at moments when Moscow is most vulnerable. Russia's strategic mobility has always depended on a predictable rhythm. Weapons move on schedule, fuel arrives exactly when needed, and reinforcements flow across the front without delay. The strike on the rail network disrupted the entire system in a single moment. It forced the Russian military to rethink how it transports the essentials that keep its forces alive and functioning. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a disruption that cut directly into the operational bloodstream of the Russian army. When a blow lands at the center of a system this complex, the effects ripple outward in ways that Moscow cannot easily control. That's where the hook takes hold. Once the rhythm breaks, the war machine starts to slow, and once it slows, every other weakness becomes easier to expose. One of the most immediate consequences was the chaotic rerouting of supply lines. Russia relies on rail corridors to move heavy armor, artillery shells, and large quantities of fuel. When those lines are damaged or blocked, the military must shift to secondary routes that are longer, less secure, and more expensive to operate. Every detour adds time, every delay adds pressure. Military planners are now faced with choices they didn't expect to make, such as deciding which frontline units get priority when supplies become bottlenecked. These decisions create friction inside the chain of command, and friction eventually leads to mistakes. Ukraine knows this, and it's why targeting logistics has become a central part of their strategy. Another layer of impact comes from the loss of predictability. A functioning rail system allows Russia to coordinate offensives, manage rotations, and deliver ammunition at a pace that supports continuous operations. But when a critical link in that system is destroyed, the timeline falls apart. Commanders planning assaults must now reconsider their timing. Units expecting reinforcements may be forced to hold positions longer than intended, and troops waiting for basic necessities might face shortages that erode morale. The hook here is simple but powerful. Wars are not only fought with weapons but with timing, and when timing collapses, even superior firepower struggles to compensate. The financial burden adds another strain. Repairing a rail network valued at nearly $500 million is not something Russia can resolve overnight, especially while pouring enormous resources into the ongoing conflict. Every diverted ruble reduces its capacity to sustain long-term operation. The Kremlin is already dealing with sanctions, economic slowdown, and growing military expenses. A hit of this magnitude piles even more weight onto a system that's already under stress. The military leadership understands that replacing infrastructure at this scale requires time, manpower, and funds that could have been used at the front. This creates a tension between maintaining the war effort and repairing the damage needed to keep that effort functioning. This strike also forced Russia to reposition defensive assets to protect other vulnerable sections of its rail network. Every drone, missile system, or unit redirected to guard infrastructure is one less asset available for active combat. That redistribution of resources weakens Moscow's posture in multiple areas. And once the enemy makes you defend your own ground, they've already taken the initiative. The hook becomes clear. Ukraine didn't just damage rails, it shifted the balance of who reacts and who dictates the pace. Finally, the psychological effect on Russian command circles is impossible to ignore. For a system built on centralized logistics, losing a major rail artery is a reminder that its vulnerabilities are more exposed than expected. It forces military planners to operate cautiously, constantly wondering where the next strike will land. That uncertainty slows decision-making, increases internal pressure, and creates the sense that the battlefield is expanding into areas once considered safe. Russia's mobility advantage isn't just weakened, it's now unpredictable, and unpredictability is one of the most dangerous liabilities in a war that depends on steady momentum. The psychological impact of this strike inside Russia reaches far beyond the infrastructure that was destroyed. It hits at something far more sensitive, the belief that the state is fully in control. For years, the Kremlin has projected an image of stability and strength, insisting that nothing happening in the war can shake the foundations of Russian society. When a major rail network, worth nearly $500 million, is taken out in one coordinated strike, that image begins to crack. People start to question how a country with one of the world's largest security systems can fail to protect something so essential. This is where the hook takes hold. Doubt spreads faster than any military report, And once doubt settles in, it becomes incredibly hard for any government to erase. Inside the Kremlin, pressure builds in a different way. Officials understand that public perception is just as important as battlefield success. When citizens feel secure, the government can keep operating with confidence. But when key networks start collapsing under enemy attacks, the leadership must respond quickly to restore the illusion of control. That urgency often leads to rushed decisions, escalated rhetoric, or symbolic retaliations meant to reassure the population. These reactions can create additional complications for Russia's military planning, because choices made for political reasons don't always align with strategic needs. And the more often the Kremlin feels cornered into dramatic displays of power, the more strained its decision-making process becomes. Another element of psychological pressure comes from within the elite. Business leaders, political insiders, and regional officials watch these events carefully. They don't just see a damaged rail system, they see a warning that the war is reaching deeper into Russia's core. These individuals rely on stability to protect their interests, and when internal infrastructure becomes vulnerable, they begin to question the long-term sustainability of the conflict. Their concerns may not reach the public, but they influence the political environment that Putin must navigate. This creates a quiet but powerful tension. The hook emerges here. When those who support the system begin to worry, the system itself becomes weaker. For ordinary Russians, the effects of the strike appear in everyday disruption. Delayed shipments, canceled routes, and visible damage to structures that were once taken for granted all remind people that the war is no longer distant. It has reached into their routine. And when individuals start seeing the consequences with their own eyes, official statements claiming everything is under control start to lose credibility. This widening gap between narrative and reality creates a space where skepticism grows. In a country where state messaging is tightly controlled, skepticism is one of the few forces capable of shifting public attitudes. This psychological shift also influences how Russia's military and security personnel perceive their own effectiveness. When they see high-value infrastructure destroyed despite their efforts, it creates frustration and uncertainty within the ranks. Soldiers and officers begin to question whether the resources they have are sufficient to protect the nation. This kind of internal doubt can slow initiative, reduce confidence, and weaken the motivation needed to sustain long-term operations. Once hesitation enters a military system, it spreads quietly but steadily, and Ukraine benefits every time that hesitation appears. The broader effect is that Russia must now manage not only the physical damage, but the erosion of trust. Every major strike communicates that the war is not contained. It's a message delivered directly to the population, bypassing the state's filters. And while the Kremlin will try to restore confidence through strong statements or retaliatory threats, the image of a burning rail network remains in people's minds. It lingers as proof that vulnerabilities exist where they shouldn't. That image is the hook that continues to pull at the edges of Russia's confidence long after the smoke clears. The strike marks a turning point in the war's larger trajectory by showing that Ukraine is no longer limited to hitting frontline targets, but now commands the capability to damage critical infrastructure deep within Russian territory. That ability signals a shift away from reactive defense toward proactive disruption, and that shift carries immense strategic weight. By inflicting serious damage on high-value assets like a major rail network, Ukraine is demonstrating that it can challenge Russia's underlying war support structures, not just momentarily, but with long-term consequences. That's the hook. When you hit the backbone instead of the limbs, everything starts to wobble. This evolution in capability cannot be seen as incidental or isolated. Rather, it reflects the growing maturity of Ukraine's strategy, one that leverages precise intelligence, long-range strike capability, and careful target selection. By doing so, It elevates the war from isolated skirmishes to a form of strategic attrition designed to erode Russia's capacity to wage large-scale operations. The cumulative cost of repeated damage to logistics, infrastructure, and transport networks begins to compound. Russia may replace rails, bridges, or supply depots one by one, but the cumulative burden of repair, rerouting, and reinforcement drains resources, attention, and time. Ukraine isn't simply contesting territory. It's steadily eroding Russia's ability to manage, supply, and sustain war over distance. The broader implication of this shift is how it affects long-term planning on both sides. For Russia, every mission, every movement, every supply convoy now carries greater risk. The war no longer ends at the front lines. It permeates deep into the rear. That makes every decision more fraught. Every repair may be undone. Every supply line might be targeted. The unpredictability introduced by these strikes undermines strategic confidence. Russia's war planners must now factor in a fragility few acknowledged existed before. That uncertainty weakens resolve, forces resource reallocation, and increases the chance of strategic miscalculation. For external observers and potential allies, this pattern sends a clear message. This conflict is evolving, and it's evolving in a way that favors calculated disruption, precision, and asymmetric leverage. Other nations watching Ukraine's ability to strike long-range infrastructure are likely to reconsider their own calculations about support, involvement, or deterrence that has broader geopolitical implications. What once seemed like a contained war may now present a paradigm where peripheral powers play strategic roles, not just by sending equipment, but by contributing to Ukraine's capacity to destabilize Russia's internal war network. That's a powerful message to states weighing their position in the conflict. Another underappreciated effect is the impact on Russia's domestic politics. When the war's pressures extend into regions once considered safe, public tolerance becomes harder to sustain. The ongoing repairs, rerouted rail traffic, disruptions to civilian supply lines, and visible evidence of destruction challenge the narrative of invincibility. As the war enters this new phase, discontent may grow among populations from the front, eroding internal cohesion and creating new pressures on the leadership. That internal strain adds an unpredictable variable to what was already a high-stakes war. Finally, this shift reveals something fundamental about modern warfare, that it is no longer determined solely by battles and territorial gains. It's determined by endurance, resilience, and the capacity to strike when and where it matters most. By hitting infrastructure rather than just front lines, Ukraine shows it understands this truth. The dynamics change from controlling land to controlling supply, from capturing towns to undermining power, and that change reshapes not only the war's present but its likely endgame.